Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to my colleagues. Not always the sexiest of topics, you know, public employment, but absolutely critical if we're going to do the best that we can for the people of this country. I think while it's inevitable we're going to discuss today the challenges of the hiring process, I think it's important to highlight that we're having this discussion against a backdrop of the current hiring freeze in the federal government. While the public sector cannot do its job, when the public sector in North Dakota cannot do its job, the private sector has a more difficult time doing its job. From making sure the food we eat is safe, to answering taxpayers' inquiries about tax law, to ensuring our veterans are cared for, to protecting our nation from harm, federal employees in my state work every day to make my state and, in fact, the country better. When we fail to fill needed vacancies unnecessarily, the only people we're hurting are ourselves. And I want to tell a quick story. During the huge boom of oil development in North Dakota, we had a very difficult time recruiting federal workers, engineers, into the agencies that help provide permitting. It was so bad, in fact, that the industry offered up resources to hire and to expand the pay of the current federal employees. I think it was eye-opening for many of us who for years might say that the federal employees are a drag on the economy, to realize that the industry, the oil industry in my state, could not function without a fully staffed federal BLM. So across the board cuts and the shrinking of the overall federal workforce are not the answer to making the federal government more efficient or more effective. These cuts will also come at the expense of talent, morale, and the mission of our workforce, none of which we can afford to lose. Managers play a vital role in the culture of an agency and are responsible for giving employees the tools they need to succeed and thrive in the workplace. While today's hearing, of course, is not focused on the hiring freeze, it's important to keep in mind how a freeze directly and indirectly impacts the ability of managers and employees to do their job effectively and keep morale high. I'm looking forward to examining how we can help managers use the tools that are available to them to more efficiently, as well as to make them more efficient, as well as how we can improve supervisor training. I will be doing all that I can to protect federal workers. And I think it's important that we are in continued communication with the administration regarding how they plan to implement initiatives going forward. We've been at this table before, the two of us, talking about the aging of the federal workforce, talking about recruiting the best and brightest Americans to a job and a career in public service. We've been here talking about what managers' tools we need. These are all great challenges in moving our country forward and making our government responsive to the needs of the people. We can't take a step backward. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'm grateful for our attention in this Congress to the federal workforce. I hope that we'll be able to see innovations that will lead to better outcomes for public employees, for public managers, and as a result, better outcomes for the people of our country. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I couldn't agree more. I think most of us who come from state entities where you do biennial budgeting, where you have more predictability, find that to be a much more humane system and a much more predictable system. I want to start out with you, Mr. Valdez. As you heard in my opening statement, I'm concerned about the hiring freeze and the morality, or the probably some of that too, but the morale and the kind of disruption that uncertainty creates within a working force. And I know that in your testimony you have said you believe the hiring freeze will have a chilling effect on the ability of the federal government to attract and recruit the talent that it needs. You know, as you can see from my opening statement, we had a situation where people saw what happens when you don't have people in federal positions. So I want to ask you, how does the freeze and the negative publicity surrounding that impact the agency's ability to meet its mission, both here and in our states? And what message does a hiring freeze send to managers and employees about the value of their work, to Mr. Carper's point?
Well, I think you've raised a number of issues, but in terms of the chilling effect, people like certainty in their employment. And that's what we're referring to, is that if you think that the federal government is not a place where you can find reasonable employment and have a secure job, then that does have a chilling effect, and particularly on individuals who are coming into the federal government.
And I just want to make this point, that frequently the vacancies that we have will be highly sought after, where they'd be highly technical. And so you have 3 people, now someone leaves, and those 2 know that there's no way they can fill that gap. They get frustrated, and now they're bearing the brunt, and they can find employment someplace else. I mean, it's a meat axe to something that we should be looking at very strategically. And I have a concern about what that means for highly sought-after employees and basically people seeing public service as a career. Ms. Johnson, in addition to the immediate impact of the hiring freeze, I'm also concerned about the long-term plan that was alluded to in the executive order. You have said that FMA steadfastly opposes any blind, arbitrary plan to cut the federal workforce. What do you think are the dangers of arbitrarily making these cuts to the federal workforce, and what's the long-term impact of that pronouncement?
Yes, ma'am. I look at the arbitrary cuts across the federal government as being detrimental to the mission of the agencies. As any company, there are areas that we can cut the budget and the personnel within those agencies, but to do a blanket across-the-board cut of all federal agencies, I think is going to be detrimental to them being able to move forward with the mission that they have been provided, and putting people in those positions that have to take on the duties of others as their counterparts leave, that puts additional pressure on them and impacts the morale of the agencies.
And isn't it likely that those people who can leave, when they do, and it's hard to fill that position, it's going to have a cascading effect?
Oh, absolutely.
And
it will impact
probably
them as
in
well
those areas, whether it's cyber, where there's a whole lot of competition in the private sector for that kind of talent and skill set. But even if I can say, you know, it takes 20 people in housekeeping to make up the beds and you only have 10, you won't stay in business very long as a hotel if you can't hire to replace the people who are going to be making up the beds and cleaning the rooms. So maybe that's a context that can be appreciated in a different category. I have to just back out just for a little bit here, and I'll be back, so I'll defer the rest of my time, albeit very small amounts, to the chairman, and I'll be returning. If I can just kind of build on that, because I think one of the areas that I completely agree with Mr. Cox is in management supervision. You know, so you get the absolute best floor nurse, you promote her to a role where he or she is going to do scheduling. Maybe not even interested in it, but in order to move up the pay ranks, that's a promotion, you're going to do it. And we don't say, here's the bundle of supervisory training that we're going to give you, management training, to see if this is something that you can do. In fact, maybe the best nurse manager would be somebody who's not a very good nurse. And so you know, that's one of the challenges. And included with this issue, I'd like to throw in the bill that I've introduced, which is the supervisory training bill. I'm going to introduce it again in the 115th. And so to Senator Langford's point, how much would supervisory training, really quality supervisory training, take care of a lot of the problems that we're talking about today, rather than simply, you know, kind of arbitrary, you know, now we're going to reduce, you know, probationary times, you know, the maybe easy fixes that don't really fix anything.
Mr. Corsi.
Senator, I would agree with Mr. Cox on the issue of managers, but you also have to understand the managers are torn many different ways day in and day out. The human capital experts on employee relations, we have hugely reduced those staffs with reductions over the last 15 years. In the Air Force, I would say 50% reduction on our personnel management side of the house. Because with all the budget challenges, and you got the mission and you got the support side, those staffs have taken a disproportionate hit. Managers, day in and day out, are weighing the value of pursuing the disciplinary action and knowing the commitment on their part that it's going to take to pursue those versus turning a blind eye, which is not ideal, but they're making those value judgments. The 2-year probationary period would go a long way in now giving managers the time to deal with performance issues. Unless the manager was very aggressive, going through all the process, even with the 1-year probationary period, it is very difficult to get everything that needs to get done within that first year. The 2-year probationary period, to be quite honest with you, would give management the flexibility to be able to go through that due process that they need to go to before, working with the employee, performance improvement plans, in order to work that process.
So we've just heard from Mr. Cox that we have a 2-year probationary period de facto building, in fact, 70%. What's the proof that a probationary period actually accomplishes what you suggest it might accomplish, given that 70% of the workforce is already under a 2-year probationary period?
For Department of Defense, the NDAA of 2015 put the 2-year probationary period in effect. All I would say, it's probably a little too soon. And again, since I retired the end of October, I don't know what that experience has been, because it was...
I just want to say that I didn't, I've managed, by this town, not a very big workforce, but I ran big organizations in North Dakota that had property rights to their jobs, and you had to go through the process. It would never have taken me 2 years to know that I had somebody I didn't need in my workforce. And so to suggest that this is the end-all and be-all is problematic to me, because it may in fact be that this person would be a wonderful person with the right supervisory skills, could in fact emerge as one of the best employees you could ever have. But if you don't have attention focused by managers on developing the skill sets of who they are, I don't see any amount of time, what's the old idiom that work expands for the time that you've given to fill it. And 2 years, 15 months, I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that that's the fix to the problem we have, that we have public employees who stay on the rolls too long in an ill-fitting position, and we have managers who don't know how to inspire and train employees to be good employees.
So I completely agree with you, and I completely agree with Mr. Cox, and
Senator Langford, completely agree with Senator Langford.
Everybody, I'm in complete agreement. One of the first things that happened to me when I was a new SES was I denied an employee a promotion, and that employee then filed a grievance on me for age discrimination, and it took me 6 months to resolve that. And the end result was that, I denied her the promotion. But it was wearing, and it was very time-consuming. After that, I became the manager of the department's EEO shop. And what I found there was that there was a lot of forum shopping. People would come in, they'd had an adverse personnel action against them, and they would be seeking a way to address that through the employment, through the EEO process. A lot of this gets to, I really support your notion of supervisory training, because it certainly is needed. Managers do need to know what their rights are, and in my testimony, we talk about this a lot. But we also talk about agency culture. It has now come to the point with a lot of agencies, and I will speak mostly about the Department of Energy, where it is considered to be too much trouble to deal with poor performers, and that as Bob said, you have so many constraints on your time that you just want to make these things go away.
Can I ask you, are you familiar with my bill?
No.
The man, okay. It would be great if you would look at it,
Okay.
make any suggestions that your organization wants to make. I totally agree. I think that you can take that great nurse and during the period of time provide leadership, have them understand the dynamics of the group, and actually move them into a management way if you build leaders. I couldn't agree with you more. I think our challenge right now is that we look for the easy, the easy fix. None of this is easy, and growing leadership and growing management skills, because it's two sides of the same coin, is not easy, but people have to see there's some benefit in their career to take that on. Let's talk about the senior nurse, or in my case, I'll give you a personal example. One of my first jobs was working in a legal section of the tax department in my state. The man who headed that up, the general counsel, probably one of the best attorneys in the state of North Dakota, and probably one of the best attorneys I've ever worked with, and I've worked with great attorneys. Wasn't exactly a good manager, but I learned so much from him that it gave me the confidence to move forward. We should reward him rather than putting the management responsibility. We should reward him for being a mentor in place, for building the capacity and building the leadership. And, I understand that there has to be a hierarchy, but the best organizations have invisible hierarchy, in my opinion. They have a unified, consistent purpose in what they're doing, and people know everybody's role. They know what their responsibilities are, and they come to a point of achievement together. And so that's not easy all the time when you're trying to take, my dad's army, don't ask questions, just march in that. That's not the Army anymore. And wouldn't be successful recruiting people to that model anymore. We have to get away from kind of old ideas and old thinking about hierarchies and start thinking about leadership and management. I totally agree. I would welcome any input that you have. We haven't introduced it yet, but curious about what you think we could do more.
Well, let me give you one further input then while I have the chance, which is that training budgets have been slashed throughout the federal government. It's usually one of the first things that go. And I think one of the things that you should consider when you're, thinking about this training is giving agencies funding and finding ways to carve out dedicated line item funding for this kind of training, because it doesn't exist and it's the first thing that's cut.
I would just say, you're not going to find disagreement with us on that. You and I both know training is often farmed out to some other outside group, and they come in, and sometimes the employees find it to be helpful, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes the way they do training ends up on somebody's waste list at some point, and someone says, what in the world were we paying for that for? So the only thing I would say on training is, let's make sure training is effective, and that we're not just saying we're supposed to do training on a budget. This is a nearby contractor. They'll come do it for it, and we can check the box that training was done, when really no one saw it was useful at the end of it.
I have another appointment that I have to rush off to. I just want to also ask that a statement of the National Treasury's Employment Union be entered into the record.
Without objection. So I think we're okay.
Yeah, and I look forward to a continuing discussion. I want to thank Senator Langford for making the federal workforce a major priority of this committee. We started that work last Congress. We're going to continue. So don't think this is your one chance. No. We want to hear from you. I'm always amazed when we get into these discussions how, no matter what perspective you have, we kind of come down to the same thing. And so that means there's an answer. And that means that if we make the investment of time on the oversight side of the dais to listen to what you all are challenged with, that we can make real progress. And maybe we can have fewer employees if we have more productive employees, happier employees, less turnover. And so there's a way that we can do this without breaking any budgets, I guess is my point.